So, starting us off, sex, gender, and transgender employees, what it all means for employers. Joining us today to give this presentation is Andria Ryan. Andria is the co-chair, Hospitality Industry Practice Group at Phillips. She's out of the Atlanta office, but Phillips is a nationwide law firm representing employers. She's also Deputy General Counsel of the firm. She was a member of the COVID-19 task force, may still be, if they still have that. And she's been honored by Colorado, South Carolina, and the Washington Hospitality Associations. And we're always fortunate to have her join us. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Andria Ryan.
Nice to be here. Cool. I guess I'm charged my own AD. Stephen says it's just random that I'm always speaking first at conferences. I don't really believe him. But we'll take what I can get, right? For 30 plus years, I've been practicing employment law only, representing management, almost exclusively in the hospitality industry. For the first 25-ish, I never spoke to a single client about transgender employees, sexual identity, gender expression. But then we had COVID, so that's all we talked about for a couple of years. And now we're back to normal discussions with employers about challenging employee situations. And across the country, I'm talking to clients and their leaders about how to handle these very sensitive situations. So there's some legal concerns and there's some practical issues. I think the practical issues are almost as important as the legal ones, but let's cover the legal ones. First one. Congress passed Title VII in 1964. I wasn't there, I was one, but I am fairly certain that when they passed Title VII that prohibits discrimination based on race, national origin, religion, color, and sex, which was a controversial topic at the time, we included, they did not contemplate sexual orientation, gender identity, transgender status, or transition status at the time. So it left us with a gap. Congress has not made any changes to Title VII. I mean, they've added over the years pregnancy and age and some other things, but they haven't touched on this issue, so they've left a gap in the federal level when it comes to discrimination harassment statutes. Some states and courts and administrative bodies, including the federal one, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, are trying to fill in the gaps. So what we had was in June 2021, the Supreme Court issued the Bostock or the Clayton County decision, which came out of Georgia, and a year later, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the federal agency that tracks and investigates discrimination cases at the federal level, issued guidance regarding sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. So here's where we're starting to see the gaps filled in. Now, I'm trying to follow along on my own laptop. I don't worse than me. This was the Bostock decision issued by the Supreme Court was it was 3 consolidated cases. 2 employees had claimed that they had been terminated because of their sexual orientation, and 1 because of their transgender status. The lower courts found Title VII does not cover transgender status or sexual orientation. The Supreme Court disagreed. Basically, they addressed whether an employer can fire someone simply for being homosexual or transgender. That was the issue for the court. The court concluded yes, it violates Title VII. An employer who fires an individual for being homosexual or transgender fires that person for traits or actions that would not have questioned members of a different sex. Sex played a necessary role, therefore a violation of Title VII. Notably, they did not deal with the issue of religious freedom, provide any issues related to First Amendment or religious freedom as provided for in Title VII. So that's how we got the Supreme Court decision. The EEOC, not surprisingly, issued some guidance, next slide, Mo, agreeing with the Supreme Court's decision, obviously, but also providing some guidance. Cannot discriminate against an individual based on sexual orientation or gender identity. We've not heard, now we're seeing situations that deal with sexual preference, not sexual preference, but sexual identity, but they dealt with gender identity, sexual orientation, and not some of the other more fluid issues so far. But I think that's the way we should expect the agency to go. So we can't create or tolerate harassment based on sexual orientation or gender identity, including customers, clients, guests, coworkers. We'll come back to that when we talk about the practical issues. Use customer preferences with regard to employees' sexual orientation or gender identity. Discriminating against someone because they don't conform to a sexual stereotype. Require a transgender employee to dress or use the bathroom in accordance with the employee's sex assigned at birth. This is an issue. This is a very, very practical issue. Or retaliate against an employee for complaining about or participating in an investigation related to something like this. Every single employment law has an anti-retaliation provision, so no big surprise that we would see this here as well. Now, let's talk about disability discrimination. So we talked about gender discrimination, where we've got, an inclusive umbrella here. The Fourth Circuit has joined a couple of other growing number of district courts ruling that gender dysphoria can be a disability under the federal discrimination laws. Gender dysphoria is a medical condition, and it's where there's an incongruence between a gender identity and assigned sex, and it results in clinically significant distress. So a diagnosed disability. Now, this needs to be distinguished from somebody who prefers to identify as a female or prefers to identify or dress as a male. This is someone with a diagnosed disorder. And the Fourth Circuit rejects the idea that anybody that is transgender has this gender dysphoria condition, but the Fourth Circuit's agreed, which is here, we're in the Fourth Circuit here, obviously, and that we, in addition to non-discrimination, which is what the Americans with Disabilities Act provides for, we have to reasonably accommodate an employee with gender dysphoria. Now, from a practical standpoint, most of the companies that I'm working with aren't asking employees. They've identified as transgender. They're not taking that next step to say, are you diagnosed with gender dysphoria or not? Because if you're not diagnosed with gender dysphoria, I may not accommodate you. That's not from a practical standpoint what I'm seeing employers do. But the legal obligation, the potential legal risk lies here with an employee with a diagnosed disability. All right, let's talk about some of these practical issues. The real practical issues. Restrooms and locker rooms. The Department of Justice and OSHA, have ruled on this. The Department of Justice says federal contractors must allow transgender employees to use restrooms and other facilities consistent with their gender identity. Most of our clients are not likely to be covered by the Department of Justice or through federal contractors. Most of them in this industry are not, although some are. OSHA has also issued guidance under the sanitation standard, which requires prompt and reasonable access to sanitary facilities. So OSHA has specifically stated that includes transgender employees, and they should have access to restrooms that correspond with their gender identity. We're also seeing a lot of local and state agencies, state and local legislatures that are moving in this direction as well. We're also seeing some bathroom ban laws that are falling under scrutiny. Bathroom ban laws is what we saw in North Carolina, for example, right? North Carolina passed initially and then reversed itself, passed a law stating we're not going to allow transgender. You have to go use the restroom of your assigned birth gender. And they are coming under a lot of scrutiny. In fact, North Carolina reversed that after they did. So we've got a patchwork of legal compliance issues, and now we have to deal with practical considerations. So let's look at the next slide, where we'll talk about appearance policies. I think even for open-minded people, and I think this industry obviously is very diverse, culturally, age-wise, sexual orientation. We've got a very diverse industry. We also have a humongous staffing problem. So most of our clients are not trying to turn employees away, but they have to deal with this very practical issue. So if you've got an individual, if one of our clients has an individual that comes in and says, I'm transgender or I identify as a male or female, my practical advice to them is go with it. You can require strict adherence to the policy. So if I've got a biological male that is that's applying for a job, and he shows up to work with pink lipstick and a 5 o'clock shadow, I'm going to say, in a respectful and sensitive way which of the we have various policies for our female employees and our male employees, which of the two are you going to comply with, and we're going to require strict compliance. You can choose. We're okay if you want to go by Samantha, if you want to, we don't care if you want to identify one way or the other. We're going to require strict compliance. But what about the individual comes in and says, I'm gender fluid, and sometimes I identify as a male, and sometimes I identify as a female. What do we say to that? The client called me and asked that question, and I said, well, that's a first. Well, the same thing. That day, he came in with a pretty heavy 5 o'clock shadow and pink hair and lipstick. So we're okay with what you choose, but on the day that you're going to be identified as a male, you need to comply with the male standards. On the days you identify as a female, you need to comply with the female standards. And I think all of this depends on what our client's business is. And I told a 5-star resort client this week, this might work at Amazon's warehouse. You know, an employee who's wearing a dress and a beard, that might be okay, but it's not going to work at this particular 5-star resort. So I think we need to be upfront with folks, be sensitive about it, but what I'm urging all of my clients to do is address these concerns directly with the applicant or the employee. And what we want to do is try to make sure this employee doesn't become a militant employee about this issue. We want them to know that we're willing to work with them. We do have some standards that we're going to require our employees, his coworkers or her coworkers, to use their preferred pronoun preferences. But please understand that people slip. Please understand that this may not go exactly smoothly, but we'll step in as necessary. But we're very respectful and we're very sensitive. But the first thing we're going to deal with is appearance policies. I think that's not as hard as the next issue. The next issue is the next issue is addressing the coworkers and guests. So if I'm using a restroom or a locker room of my gender preference and my coworkers don't like it, then that's when we have our concerns raised. I mean, if we're being sensitive with the individual applicant or the employee, that's one thing. But we've got employees who are going to share locker rooms and restrooms and spa guests, and fitness center guests, we're going to share private places with employees who may not be the gender that they're representing. So, you know, one thing I want to remind us and our clients is the first interaction that our employees and our guests have that are going to present this issue is usually not with HR or a department head or the general manager. They're presenting it to a frontline employee, or they're presenting it to a frontline supervisor. So we've got to make sure those folks are ready and prepared to discuss these sensitive issues with employees and bring it to somebody's attention for some help. If I'm a coworker and I say I'm not willing to use the restroom, I know my coworker is a biological male, and I'm uncomfortable with this, then the alternative is I can go somewhere more private. Make available to me, if we're uncomfortable, a private restroom, a gender-neutral restroom, or something. But we are required to allow the employee who is transgender or transitioning to use the restroom of their choice. So we're potentially dealing with two folks that are going to be kind of new. The other challenge that we're seeing pretty regularly is guests. So I recently had a client with a spa who said they had a biological male who was very clearly a biological male that came into the spa and wanted to use, said identifies as a female, wearing female clothing, wanted to use the female locker room at the spa. Everyone became very uncomfortable because they had a large group of women in, a book club that was in there, they were all in there, and there was some women, young women, there was 15 and 16-year-old girls in there. So they became very concerned that they were going to have a complete uproar in the spa. Their decision was, I think, very wise. They told the guest that that was the problem, that we have a large number of older women and some younger women in there, and that this might not go very smoothly. Would they consider alternative number one, use the men's locker room for today? In the future, we won't require that, but today, would you mind? Or we'll go to a common area and just don't use either one of the restrooms. And we'll be happy to comp some of your services, you know, because we're requiring this, we're requesting this of you. So I think they handled it in a delightful way, and it worked out just fine. But I also remember that the person that this guest interacted with was not a manager or a department head or the head of the spa. The person they interacted with was the receptionist at the spa. And so our entire workforce needs to have some level of sensitivity on this issue. And so I urge that as well. Here's some best practices for you. Make sure you're aware of any state or local laws. We've got a number, and it's where you would expect it, right? It's going to be California, Colorado, the Northeast, Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin. We're starting to see, that's where we start to see the trends in the state and local level. Make sure the hiring decisions are based solely on merit, that folks are prepared to address this sensitive issue, that your recruiting folks are prepared to address this sensitive issue in an interview, perhaps, up front, and again, respectfully and sensitively. Be alert to bullying or other unprofessional conduct. I had a client call me the other day, an assistant front office manager, who they have warned about this behavior before, but continues to call a coworker who is effeminate but male, queen and queer, and introduces him to guests, says, oh, the queen will help you when he's done doing whatever he's doing at the front desk. And this is a 50-something-year-old female assistant front office manager who's being terminated for violation of the company's no harassment policy, because that's what it is. She's been warned, she's been asked, and now she's going to be terminated for violation of the no harassment policy. The other thing is, I think it's important that our clients upgrade their policies. EEO policies need to include sexual preference, sexual orientation, transgender status, gender identity. The harassment policy needs to address those issues as well, and we need to be prepared to strictly enforce them. I do not recommend, although as you saw on my slide about disability discrimination, we can certainly ask before we accommodate if somebody actually suffers from a disability like gender dysphoria. I'm not sure it's necessarily a wise practice. Often, depending on what the accommodation request is, but if the accommodation request is simply I want to dress as a female or a male, and I want to use the facilities of female or male, I'm not sure requiring proof other than their word is really worth any expensive cost like the employee. Mo, you got me on that one? Yeah. As I mentioned before, we need to train employees and leaders because most of the interactions, these very difficult and sometimes very sensitive interactions are going to occur at a frontline level. So an employee or a supervisor level employee is going to be approached by a guest or a coworker about being uncomfortable in this situation. So I train them on the policies with appropriate emphasis on what your expectations are on an inclusive environment and what our expectations are in terms of harassment as well. Be open-minded. I think we get very far by dealing with a sensitive situation up front with an employee. They know what the challenges are. They know what their coworkers are likely going to say and do. So why don't we talk to them up front and say, we understand, we'll work with you, we'll do what we can to make sure people are respectful in your work environment. Please let us know when they're not. So let's be open-minded about that discussion. Respect the employee's privacy. One of the questions I asked a leadership group recently was, if Sam decided he wants to be Samantha, he's going to work at the front desk, he's a bellman, we're going to let him dress like a woman? Yeah, well, not hard. What do we do about locker rooms and restrooms? Okay, it gets a little bit harder. And what do we tell his employees? Do we announce this? Do we have a meeting with employees? By the way, your coworker Sam is now Samantha. They'll appreciate you saying nice things and being respectful. And I said, I think we talked to Sam or Samantha about how we want it handled, but we do not we don't talk about this kind of issue about any of our employees. We don't talk about their sexual preferences. We don't talk about their appearances. So it's not something that I think we should, as an employer, be prepared to do other than manage the sensitive situation behind the scenes. And where possible, accommodate. And as I mentioned, in this industry, the accommodations that I'm generally seeing, we've identified, right? Appearance policies and access to private areas. I mean, one client said, when talking to an individual, he insisted on using the women's locker rooms, or she insisted on using the women's locker rooms. And they were very good at talking. They said, listen, would you please be sensitive to where you change and how you change and who's present when you're when you're in a sensitive situation. If you'll do that, that'll go a long way for your coworkers to be accepting of this and to not feel uncomfortable. And the conversation went very well. So that's my advice, with all the legal concerns we have, I think the practical considerations are really much more sensitive than the legal ones. What do we got? Yeah.
How many of you are dealing with an issue that's in and around this space in your operations? Raise your hand. Yeah. And how many of you think it's just going to become more pervasive? Yeah.
I was reading it, Stephen, I was reading an article that said, and I don't remember what school district it was, it seems like it was Maryland somewhere, that said they had a 580% increase in students identifying as sexually fluid or transgender, or there's 580% increase in the last year or two. And so were there more transgender folks out there than we knew? Is it just something people are trying? I don't know. It's hard to tell. I will say that UCLA School of Law did a study, and they think that 1.4 million people identify as transgender. And the states that have the largest number of folks that identify are California, no surprise, California is always at the top of every list, Hawaii, Georgia, and New Mexico, which is a little strange, but I think there was for a while the most preeminent clinic that does transgender surgeries in New Mexico. I think there's more now. And then the lowest number was like Iowa, Wyoming, and New Hampshire or something. No big surprise there, right? North Dakota or something. So, it's 1.4 million people. There's a lot of folks that are answering that question, and we need them to work, right? We need workers.
We need them to work. And on the employment side, it's one thing, and then of course you have the guest side as well. A lot of you might work in country clubs, and that's a real challenge. With locker rooms, as you pointed out, the spa situation on the customer side. It's going to be very challenging.
But I think it's important to identify. I would go to go in your operations or in your clients and say, you need to identify the employees who are likely going to encounter this situation. Golf caddy is not going to encounter this situation, right? I mean, your engineers aren't going to, this is not a high issue in your housekeepers. We know where it is. It's at the spa, it's at the front desk, it's in HR, obviously. But we got a lot of back of the house folks. It doesn't really matter what they look like. We've seen that with tattoos and piercings and all the other things that we're relaxing. I'm seeing 5-star properties that are relaxing their standards, appearance and otherwise, tremendously to deal with a lot of these issues. What am I going to do? I had one client that said, we have a no beard policy in our female appearance standards. You have a no beard policy in your female appearance standards? They said, yeah, I'm glad I did, because that was the same client that had the guy with the pink lipstick and the 5 o'clock shadow. So we told him, look, if you're going to identify as a female and you're going to come to work as a female, look, we have a no beard policy.
You got to
I'm
shave
not really
it.
sure you needed a policy for that. It's brilliant, but
How many of you at your operations have gone to gender-neutral bathrooms? Do you know any male, female, anybody? They can go into any one. None of you? No, that can't be. Did I not ask the question the right way? You have. You've done that. Yeah, Andrea, I mean, that to me is the basic solution for our customer situation and potentially our employee situation, right? With stalls.
yes, but stalls. But if you think that's for a restroom, that's one thing. But I don't think it's going to be as easy in locker rooms.
No, I agree with
the
that.
center and the spa, you've got real challenges there.
No, I agree with that.
And safety concerns. Truly safety concerns. Do you remember the situation? Nobody wants to be that spa out in LA, right? Where you had the mother and a 15-year-old daughter in the spa and a male in the sauna that identified as female, was clearly biological male, and we had pickets outside for a while and pickets on both sides. It was very disruptive, obviously, to the spa and to their guests, but none of us want that either.
That's going to be challenging. Any questions for Andrea? Any additional questions? Oh, yeah, hold on, Jordan, let me get to it.
Jordan, you know the answers.
Just bringing up a scenario I thought would be interesting.
Yeah.
We have a hotel, a resort, and the lifeguard is now identifying as female, but, as male, but hasn't had any, actual surgery or anything of that nature, and now wants to dress as a male, dressed as a lifeguard.
And she still has breasts.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and it happened.
Yeah.
She didn't ask, she just did it. And then
Oh, that's a good one.
we had an appearance policy, you had one of your slides with the appearance policy, but that kind of fell outside the realm of the appearance
Yeah,
policy.
where it's
I think
not.
one of your bullet points was you just have to address the appropriate issue with that employee. That's just not appropriate. But as you say, it's a little dicey because, someone could say theoretically it is appropriate.
Yeah. No, that's a great example because it's just hard to anticipate what might happen, what position the employee's going to be in, and what chaos it might cause. So it's taken a pretty sensitive HR team to deal with a good number of these issues.
It's amazing what you can talk about HospitalityLawcom.
First thing in the morning.
First thing in the morning. Yeah, let's hope that everybody had their coffee. Yeah. Oh, Julia. Thanks.
I haven't seen, and this is kind of strange, but I have clients who've heard complaints about it's outside of gender, for example, an employee who identifies as an animal, like a cat, and they wear ears and a tail, and they have to be addressed seriously, but the other employees are kind of up in arms, like how they get promoted.
Right. I have, Jordan, I don't know, your lifeguard situation is, I have not, but I've read articles about folks. I just haven't seen it. I'm not sure we're attracting people in this industry that are,
Are they required to be as accommodating or something?
Well, I think it shows us that our appearance policies need to strictly apply them, right? If we've got an appearance policy and it says no tattoos and we've got employees with tattoos at the side of their neck, then we've got a problem with the consistency and enforcement. So if somebody comes in and says, I want to wear cat ears, we say, no, you can't wear cat ears to work. This is a hotel, and our guests are going to think that's crazy. And they said, we have a strict appearance policy, and they can point to 5 different examples of we're not complying with our appearance policy. That's going to be a problem. So consistent enforcement of your appearance policy within reason is critical.
Oh, another question.
Are you seeing employers develop, or would you recommend that employers develop transgender policies specific to some of these issues?
That's a great question. I was working with the group, Four Seasons is doing it. Four Seasons always doing something, stuff like that. But and I've seen some working drafts. As I read through them though, they sound like more instructions to HR. And this is what we're going to do in terms of payroll and social security numbers and all that. And then a modified version of their harassment policy for their employees. Because that's really what we want to tell coworkers. That we're an inclusive culture here, and that we're accepting of this, and we expect you to be as well and respectful to coworkers. Really, as I read it, it looks like it's part of a no harassment policy. So my inclination would be to expand your verbiage there to be inclusive, and then deal with the logistics of payroll and uniforms and all that behind the scenes. But I do think it's important, right? We all have EEO policies. Have you ever gone to work for a company that says we're not an equal opportunity employer? Never, right? Nobody does that. So we all have an EEO policy, and if it's dated, it's missing a lot of things. And I think if you really want to have a robust policy that actually, speaks to your culture, we need to start including some of these things your employees are looking for, especially young employees.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's say thank you